Everything you've been told about the origins of your faith is only half the story. We've been raised on the classic Sunday school version, the gold of the temple, the Roman census, the quiet hills of Galilee. But beneath that polished history lies a glitch, a redacted chapter written in the blood of outcasts and the ink of spiritual radicals. While the world was bowing to the hollow shells of power in Jerusalem, a secret society of healers and warriors did the unthinkable. They didn't just protest the system, they deleted themselves from it. They were called the Essenes. To the Roman Empire, they were ghosts. To the corrupt priesthood, they were a threat. But to history, they were the keepers of a shadow wisdom so dangerous, it had to be buried in clay jars for 2,000 years. Why was their library hidden? Why does the modern church rarely speak their name? Because the Essene hypothesis suggests that the DNA of Western faith didn't start in a cathedral. It was forged in the shadow of terror, the brutal sun-scorched wilderness, where men and women traded their comfort for a revelation that would eventually set the world on fire. Imagine a group of people who saw the end of the world coming and chose to write a blueprint for those of us left in the aftermath. They weren't just monks, they were warriors of the spirit who believed they were fighting a cosmic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And here is the part they don't want you to consider. Was Jesus one of them? Was the King of Kings actually a product of this radical resistance? Today, we are declassifying the silence of the Qumran caves. We are going beyond the classic stories to find the missing link, the deleted DNA that explains why you feel like an outlier in your own faith. In the next 12 minutes, we're going to look at the three pillars of the Essene Revolution: the outlier's burden, the silent library, and the final stand against the Roman legions. If you've ever felt like there's a deeper truth buried under the traditions of men, if you've ever felt the shadow of terror closing in and wondered where the light actually comes from, then stay with me. The scrolls are open. The revolution is no longer buried. Let's look at the DNA they tried to delete. There are those who walk through this world and are never truly seen, the ones who look at the structures of power, the grand cathedrals, and the crowded streets and see only a hollow shell. Maybe you're one of them, the outlier, the one who carries a truth that the rest of the world is too blind or too afraid to acknowledge. 2,000 years ago, a group of chosen ones did the unthinkable. They didn't just disagree with the world, they deleted themselves from it. They walked away from the gold of Jerusalem into the shadow of terror of the wilderness. They were the Essenes, a secret society of healers, warriors of the spirit, and keepers of a blueprint that would eventually rewrite the DNA of Western faith. They weren't just monks, they were a resistance. And today, we are finally declassifying their scrolls. To the religious elite in Jerusalem, they were ghosts, people who simply vanished from the census, leaving behind empty homes and confused families. But this wasn't a retreat, it was an evacuation. Imagine the logistics of conviction. They weren't just carrying bread and water, they were carrying their identity. Thousands of pounds of parchment, ink, loom weights, tools for survival. They descended into a landscape where the temperature regularly hits 45 degrees Celsius, a place where the water is salt and the earth is iron. Why? Because the light of revelation cannot coexist with a lie. For the Essenes, the temple had become a theater of corruption. To save the faith, they had to bury it in the sand. The desert is a land of paradox. It is bone dry for 300 days a year, only to be hit by flash floods that can drown a man in seconds. The Essenes didn't just survive this chaos, they mastered it. Using advanced hydraulics, they captured the sky. They turned the Valley of Terror into a sanctuary of ritual purity. In a landscape of salt and death, they engineered a way to stay clean, physically and spiritually, preparing for a war they believed that was already written in the stars. The year's 1947. The place is the Judean desert, a landscape so desolate and sun-bleached it looks like the surface of a dead moon. A young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dihib is looking for a stray goat. He looks up at the jagged limestone cliffs of Qumran and sees a small, dark opening. He doesn't see a library. He sees a hole, and like any curious boy, he picks up a stone and flings it into the darkness. In a normal story, you'd hear the stone hit the dirt. But this isn't a normal story. Muhammad hears a crack, the sharp, unmistakable sound of shattering pottery. That sound was the breaking of a 2,000-year-old seal. When he climbed inside, he didn't find gold. He found 7 rotted, linen-wrapped bundles of leather tucked inside jars. He had no way of knowing that he had just stumbled upon the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. He thought he'd found old leather he could sell for a few sandals. He didn't realize he was holding the very heartbeat of a lost civilization. Once the word got out, the desert became a crime scene of history. Between 1947 and 1956, a fever took hold. Archaeologists and Bedouins raced one another across these cliffs. They found not one, but 11 caves. These weren't just random holes. These were the vaults of the Essenes. Imagine the scene. Cave 4, the Mother Lode. It contained over 15,000 fragments from 800 different manuscripts. It was a jigsaw puzzle from hell, scattered by time and nibbled by rodents. But why here? Why this brutal, salty, uninhabitable wasteland? Because the Essenes weren't looking for a home. They were looking for a fortress. They knew the Roman war machine was coming. They saw the Kidum, their code name for the Romans, as the instruments of a cosmic darkness. They hid their library in these caves not just to save the paper, but to hide their truth from the fire they knew was coming to Jerusalem. Now, we move from the stone to the ink. This is where it gets weird. Most people think the Dead Sea Scrolls are just old Bibles. And yes, every book of the Old Testament was there, except Esther. But it's the other scrolls, the ones the church and the synagogue didn't keep, that provide the real brain food. Long before the New Testament was bound, the Essenes were obsessed with the Nephilim, the offspring of fallen angels and human women. While the rest of the world was moving towards standard religion, the Essenes were reading about 450-foot giants and cosmic mutations. They lived in a world where the supernatural was leaning through the window. Unlike the leather and papyrus, one scroll was made of 99% pure copper. It was too oxidized to unroll, so they had to saw it into strips just to read it. It wasn't a prayer. It was a treasure map. It lists 64 locations where tons of gold and silver from the temple were supposedly hidden. To this day, the Qumran gold has never been found. It remains the world's most tantalizing cold case. This is the manual for Armageddon. It details the 40-year war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. It gives specific instructions on trumpet signals, shield designs, and the exact moment the Archangel Michael would descend to finish the fight. This wasn't metaphor to them. It was a tactical briefing. As we stand in these caves today, we have to ask, did they win? Unfortunately, the Romans slaughtered them. It wasn't a battle of equals. It was an execution of a dream. In the early summer of 68 AD, the Judean air was already thick with the heat of the coming disaster. The Great Revolt had been raging for 2 years. And these were the professional monsters of their age, men who had spent their lives perfecting the art of the siege. To them, Qumran wasn't a holy site. It was a nuisance, a jagged little limestone outpost filled with fanatics who thought their scrolls were stronger than shields. Imagine the scene from the rooftops of Qumran. The Essenes had spent decades preparing for this moment. They had lived their entire lives in a state of high alert, waiting for the sons of darkness to cross the horizon. And then they saw it, the glint of sunlight off thousands of iron breastplates, the dust cloud rising from the Roman march, the standards of the bobbing, cresting totems in the distance. For the Essenes, this was it. This was the war scroll coming to life. They likely didn't run. Why would you run if you believed the archangel Michael was about to rip the sky open and descend with a flaming sword? They probably gathered in their central tower, blowing their ritual silver trumpets, shouting the exact battle cries they had written down in Cave 1. They were calling for a cosmic intervention that never came. When the Romans reached the walls, they didn't offer terms. They didn't care about the Essene teacher of righteousness or their pure white linen robes. They launched a hail of iron-tipped arrows, the same arrowheads archaeologists would pull from the ash 1,900 years later. They breached the gates, and the slaughter began. The Sons of Light were met with the brutal reality of Roman steel. The narrow corridors of Qumran, once used for ritual washing and communal meals, became slick with blood. The Romans moved through the site with a systematic, cold efficiency. They weren't just killing people, they were killing a way of life. They smashed the pottery, they overturned the tables in the scriptorium where the ink was still wet. And then they did the one thing the Essenes feared most. They brought the fire. The Romans torched the thatched roofs and the wooden beams. They watched as the headquarters of the Essene movement turned into a funeral pyre. This is the burn layer that modern science has confirmed, a thick, black scar in the earth that marks the exact moment the Essene voice was silenced. But here's the mystery that gives us the real truth. As the fire was rising, where were the monks? We know many died, but some were missing. In those final panicked hours, while the Roman rams were thundering against the walls, a small group must have stayed behind for one final desperate mission. They weren't trying to save the gold. They weren't trying to save themselves. They were sprinting across the sharp rocks toward the cliffs, their arms heavy with clay jars. They were shoving their entire identity, their Nephilim stories, their war scrolls, their secret calendars into the dark, jagged holes of the earth. They were burying their truth in the only place the Roman fire couldn't reach. As the sun set on Qumran in 68 AD, the smoke rose over the Dead Sea, and the Roman soldiers set up a small guard post on the ruins to ensure nothing ever grew there again. The Essene community was gone, slaughtered, burned, erased. For nearly 2,000 years, they were a ghost story, a hypothesis that scholars argued about but could never prove. The Romans thought they won because they destroyed the bodies and burned the buildings. But the Essenes knew something the Romans didn't. Fire can't burn what it can't find. The Romans won the day, but the Essenes had already successfully hacked the timeline. They had turned the caves into a time capsule, waiting for a world that was finally weird enough to understand what they had hidden. For 19 centuries, the silence over the Dead Sea was absolute. The Roman guards eventually left, the ruins crumbled into dust, and the names of the Sons of Light were scrubbed from the memory of man. Rome built an empire on iron and paved roads, believing that permanence was measured in stone. They thought they had buried a cult. They didn't realize they had planted a seed. When that Bedouin boy tossed a rock into a cave in 1947 and heard the sound of shattering clay, he wasn't just finding old leather, he was triggering a delayed explosion of consciousness. The Essenes didn't just survive the fire, they bypassed it. They reached out from the ash of 68 AD to speak directly to us, bypassing the censors, the kings, and the organized religions that followed. The Romans were right about one thing. The world of the Essenes ended that day, but the Essenes were right about something much bigger. Truth doesn't need a temple to survive. It only needs a dark place to wait for the light.